And there's the voice.
Okay, there's the voice. Okay, everyone, welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. I was drinking more than coffee yesterday, but we won't go into that right now. Um, I am happy to be here. We're going to have a discussion today, and I'm guessing there'll be lots of questions about conventions, about presidential conventions, about what they're for, about how they've gone, about what we saw and might see. There's a lot to talk about. I actually honestly couldn't quite decide what to talk about this week, and that seemed one option, but there were many things to be talked about this week. Um, but before I plunge into that, I turn to my partner in crime and technical person this week, Jessica, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Ellison, Executive Director of the National Council for History Education, who's so pleased to host this. And as Joanne said, I am running tech support and acting as Joanne's partner in crime. So thank you for your grace in advance. So we are going to have Joanne talk with us for 30 minutes. And during that time, please do put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, in the Q&A, and then we will address those in the second 30 minutes of the program. And then after that, we will turn off the Facebook and turn off the recording and move into the after party. Please set your comments in the chat to everyone instead of hosts and panelists so that you can engage in a conversation in the chat. All right, Joanne, it's all yours.
It is all mine. And as ever, I will say to folks, if you are here for the first time, please tell folks in chat. Again, make sure you're telling everybody because this is see, I've already forgotten. They told me 2 seconds ago, 225th straight episode. I think it's a 220. Thank you, Jessica. I'm not good with numbers. That's why I'm a historian. But anyway, 225th straight episode. There's a real community of people that have built up here over that time. So if you're new, if you're here for the first time or near the first time, please tell folks in chat and you will get a robust welcome from the History Matters community. Okay, conventions. So I want to do two things in talking about conventions before opening things up for conversation. I bet chat, I have chat closed so that I won't get distracted by chat. I'm just guessing there's going to be a lot of people with a lot to say in chat. But what I want to do is two things. I want to talk first about, generally speaking, how conventions work, have worked, haven't worked. And then at the end, I want to come back and just discuss a number of other things that conventions do, whether sometimes they're intended to do these things, sometimes whether they're intended to or not, they do. So it'll be kind of two parts, but the first part really is what the heck are these conventions really about, right? And in purpose, the most obvious thing in the world to start with is that's where national parties go to confirm their choice for a presidential and vice presidential ticket. If there isn't a candidate that has a majority of a party's delegates, that's when things become somewhat interesting at conventions. And I am not, I'm a historian, so I'm not going to predict what the heck is going to happen at the Democratic convention coming up. We can talk about that if we choose in the Q&A, but it's bound to be interesting, that's for sure. But at any rate, that's the main routine purpose of these conventions is to pick a candidate. That seemingly is routine. That's seemingly something that should be easy to do. That has not always been the case in American history. And obviously, I think this year for both parties, there are many things about it that are not routine, and we'll come back to that. But I want to talk a little bit about a few conventions that did not go the way one might think as kind of a background to ways in which we might um, prepare for next week. And it might be, or next week for the convention coming up. Um, I I might be saying all this and it might be really ho-hum and it might just be here it is and we pick President Biden and Kamala Harris and here we go. But somehow, given the what some are calling a circular firing squad of people saying no, 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 that's not our candidate, I have no idea. I'm not going to predict. At any rate, let me talk briefly about some conventions in the past that will give you an idea of the spectrum of things that have happened, and really the ways in which, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, presidential nominating conventions really do have a lot to say about the state of the nation, in addition to the state of a given party at a given time. Now, they date to the 1830s. The first national party conventions date back to the 1830s. And in part, that was because you're beginning to get the rise of real political parties in a way that we would recognize them today. Andrew Jackson helps bring that in, and that helps raise him to the presidency. And that's the late 1820s. So by the time you get to the 1830s, you've got parties that are organized, that have national organization. You're beginning to get improvements in communication so that you can actually have something happen in one place and with relative speed, the news of what's happening there can get around the nation. It's actually not till 1844 that the telegraph accomplishes anything even close to what we have today as far as instantaneous or at least relatively fast coverage of what's going on. But so the 1830s is really the decade when you first get these conventions. The several of the first ones meet in Baltimore because it's close to Washington and that's convenient. So we're really looking at a different time when we're talking about these early conventions. But what you see in particularly the first half of the 19th century, um, parties are there, parties are organized, but things are still, number one, kind of in flux. This is the period of 1,000 different parties coming, parties going. The Whigs arrive, the Whigs depart. I think I've mentioned before, I've suggested to people before that if you go to the um, I think the way to find that online is I don't know what the formal way to find it is, but I always look for Google for Bio Guide, Bioguide, which brings you to the biographical guide of members of Congress. And you can go there and you can just ask for a list of all of the parties in American history. And what you will see is a vast, vast, vast number. And a lot of them are in the early-ish, mid-ish 19th century when parties were bouncing all over the place. So conventions were less predictable, nominations were less predictable, and you had real dark horse candidates kind of appear out of nowhere when people couldn't reach a consensus about who they wanted. I think the first dark horse candidate is in 1844, so that goes all the way back. And it was James Polk is the guy who comes forward, and people didn't necessarily know a lot about him or who he was, but that's who people could settle on. And I'm going to talk in a moment about 1852, which is a convention that I've studied a little bit. When you look inside at these conventions, what you see are people scrambling around trying to figure out someone that they can land on so that people can come together and unite behind that person. Again, far more common in this earlier period than today, but we'll see what comes up in the near future. In the case of 1852, you had a real deadlock among Democrats as to who they wanted to be their main presidential contender. I'm going to list the names here. Some of them you'll know about, some of them you won't, and none of them gets the nomination. Lewis Cass, Stephen Douglas, that name you know, William L. Marcy, and James Buchanan, another name you know. None of them is manages to get picked. This is the convention that I looked at some in my most recent book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. Because the main character or so of the book, Benjamin Brown French, who is a clerk in Congress for most of the years of the book, was at the convention and was trying to help organize and come up with a candidate at this 1852 convention. So through his eyes, what you see is people, like he tries to pick a hotel to stay in where the candidates he thinks might be persuadable so that the person who he wants to be the presidential candidate, Franklin Pierce, that he might be able to convince people. You see all of these shenanigans behind the scenes as people are desperately struggling to try and get someone chosen. And in the end, indeed, talk about a dark horse, Franklin Pierce, and Benjamin Brown French says, very proudly, I think I'm responsible for this. He helped a lot, that's for sure. Franklin Pierce, people don't really necessarily know who he is or what he's done. He's relatively unknown. And it's hilarious when you look at what comes out of that convention when people are trying to promote this candidate now, Democratic candidate, yay, Franklin Pierce. They don't know who he is. They haven't really heard of him. They get his name wrong. People are like, who? Pierce, who? Franklin A. Pierce, Franklin Z. Pierce. We don't know who this guy is, but yay, Pierce. He's a dark horse candidate who at least people can agree upon. And obviously, he wins and becomes president. So, dark horse candidates, surprises, conventions thrown into uproar because people just aren't in agreement. That's particularly a 19th century and really sort of mid-ish 19th century phenomenon. It's also an era worth noting when, as we've talked about before on History Matters, Congress was really at the center of political news. Presidents, not so much as today, although nowadays I would say maybe Congress and the president, who the heck knows who's at the center of our politics. But for a time in the 19th century, when you read newspapers, for example, Congress took up the majority of column inches. People followed the debates. They knew what was happening in the debates. They read versions of the debates. The presidency was important, but not as much as in the modern era where Americans think of the president leading the government. Congress played a more central role in the 19th century. Even so, you still had these conventions with people desperately trying to figure out who their presidential candidate was going to be. Now, as I started out by saying, um, conventions show a lot about the state of the nation, and a clear example of that is the Democratic National Convention in 1860. So now we're headed towards the Civil War. What happens in the Democratic National Convention and held in Charleston, South Carolina, is not only can people not agree, but the Southern delegates ultimately walk out. They cannot agree on a candidate at all. And Southern Democrats meet separately a few months later and nominate their own candidate. Northern Democrats decide that they're going to cast their votes for Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. So you want to talk about the state of the nation in 1860. Not only do they have a hard time coming up with a candidate, basically they just hold two conventions. That tells you something about the state of the nation at the time. Now, there are a lot of notorious 20th century conventions that, for one or another reason, stand out. Sometimes they go on and on and on and on with a candidate being unable to be chosen. The Democratic National Convention of 1924 is one of those. I believe it went on for over 17 days in New York. I believe there were over 100 ballots cast to try and figure out who the nominee would be. And this is a quote from the New York Times about what was happening at that convention. On the second day of that debacle, antagonisms had already reached the point where the 13,000 gallery spectators were spitting on the delegates, who were screaming, jeering, and waving their fists at one another. By the time Mr. Davis, John W. Davis, was nominated, more than 100 delegates had already packed up and gone home, having run out of money, patience, or energy. Davis was a dark horse candidate, a compromise after other candidates. New York Governor Alfred Smith was an anti-prohibitionist, and William G. McAdoo, who had the support of the Ku Klux Klan, could not get a majority. But boy, the New York Times had a lot to say about that convention. They were really there ready to talk about the unrest, at least in the case of the 1924 Democratic National Convention. 1964 Republican National Convention, just a month before the convention, Goldwater was one of 6 Republicans to vote against the Civil Rights Act. So then there was a really loud Stop Goldwater movement. And People, moderates, threw their support to other candidates, and there were massive anti-Goldwater protests outside of the convention hall. Supposedly over 40,000 people demonstrated in San Francisco, a huge, huge protest. And supposedly one sign read, Goldwater for Führer, freedom is dead, Hitler was sincere too. So Hitler references all the way back. Um, at any rate, Goldwater ended up getting that nomination and then losing to Lyndon Johnson in one of supposedly the largest defeats in presidential history. There are more. We could go on. I don't want to take all of our time talking about this before opening things up to questions, since we have so much to talk about. But there have been obviously other really fraught modern era conventions. Chicago is another one in 1968, for example. All of these fraught, sometimes violent, protest-ridden campaign conventions. I have to sneeze. Hang on, folks. As I said last week when this happened, my mother would say, sneezing on the truth. Sneezing on the truth. All of these fraught conventions really tell you something about the state of the nation at the time. Whether in the 19th century, they're divided over slavery, in the 20th century, they're divided over civil rights. They are sort of a flashpoint of what Americans are thinking about, how parties are trying to grapple with it. And you see people trying to come up with some kind of a solution that, on the one hand, will encompass people's concerns, and on the other hand, be popular enough and I don't want to say pleasing, someone who can be marketed, put it that way, in a way that will win an election for a particular party. So conventions as, on the one hand, the routine place where candidates are chosen, conventions also as places that absolutely reflect the state of the nation at the time that they're happening. I want to mention a few other things that conventions do, whether they're intended to or not, and then briefly touch on what we just saw this last week. Obviously, other things that presidential nominating conventions do, they're supposed to spread a message, a theme, a vision, a why, right? They're supposed to somehow or other offer a reason, not just here's a candidate you should vote for, but why. Why should you vote for this person? What is the platform? Now, the Republicans in the semi-recent past, their platform often has just been Trump. That's it. We don't really have a platform. We're not pitching any policies, although Project 2025, not discussed at the convention, but still something that one might consider a policy handbook of sorts. Despite that, most of the convention and most of former President Trump's speech at the convention was about Trump. This is me. This is my party. Let me talk to you about me and why I'm great. The convention showed precisely where that party is. So message, vision, platform, all of that's supposed to emerge, sometimes in ways that are planned, sometimes in ways that are not planned, from a convention. Another thing that conventions show, and in this case, I think not necessarily as controlled a something, but certainly something that you can see, and that is the mood of a party at a given time, right? That where a party is, how its members, or at least those who are at the convention, are conducting themselves, what they're acting like, what they seem moved by, what they seem excited by. We saw, or certainly I saw, many photographic images of people at the convention with big, weird bandages on their ears. That tells you precisely where, for many people, the party is Trump. It's about Trump. It's about one person. It's not about a candidate. It's a party centered on a person in a very particular kind of way. So certainly that mood and message was clear just in watching what was going on the floor of the convention. Another thing that conventions do, and again, deliberately, but probably also in ways that can't fully be controlled, they put on display the goods that are up for sale, right? Who is being pitched? What do they have? What are they offering as candidates? what are they showing Americans as to what they represent? Now, I will fully confess I did not watch the entire 90-minute speech that former President Trump gave last night. I saw some of it. Um, I do not think I have seen any positive accounts of that speech. I think there are people, some reporters who are claiming that he was more, it was a softer Trump. I'm sorry, but that is not what I saw. I saw someone stand up and kind of meander around and go off script and tell the same stories about Hannibal Lecter and whatever else it is that he does, and talk about crazy Nancy Pelosi and make a hammering gesture. So he did his shtick. Former President Trump did his shtick. So if part of a convention is showing the goods and what you're offering the nation, that's it. That's what you've got. That's what he's offering the nation. That was a moment to speak to the nation and really show people who you are and what you've got and why they should support you. And that was the choice he made at the convention to spread that message. So it says something about precisely what the Republicans are offering. We will be watching the Democratic convention and drawing similar conclusions based on what we see, which may or may not be the same as what they want us to see. Who the heck knows what's going to happen at the next convention? But what we did see yesterday and in that convention was people gesturing towards and occasionally using, I suppose, maybe the word unity, but really, really, really not indicating that at all, right? Mass deportation is not a unity message. That's a chaos and violence message. The Nancy Pelosi hammering gesture, sorry, that's not unity. So although after the assassination attempt, I can't quite believe that's a sentence. After the assassination attempt, which is already behind us because we've moved on to another story in the news, but after the assassination attempt, it was people were, of course, talking about how like maybe the tone will shift. Maybe the tone will be softer. Maybe there'll be a gesture towards unity and getting along. And despite the talk of that sort, that was not what we saw at that convention, right? And that, in a sense, maybe is the most worthwhile thing to put in your mind in thinking about how you are considering what was just seen at the Republican convention and what you're going to see, whatever that is, in the Democratic convention. On the one hand, there will be attempts to offer a particular message, probably some of them really blunt and heavy-handed. There will be attempts to suggest lots of support for something or someone, and that's what the convention is for. But there will also be what we see and what we think and what we can conclude about the party and where it is and what it really is offering. And we can judge for ourselves how we feel about that. So in a sense, a convention is a kind of advertisement. And like any advertisement, it's selling goods, but we are the consumer. And we have to decide for ourselves what we think about the goods being offered, to be crass about it. We need to evaluate what we're seeing. It's all about the hoopla and celebration and balloons and whatever else normally happens at conventions. But in the end, as with so many other things that we've been talking about recently here on History Matters, what matters is us. They're holding those conventions and televising them for us. They're trying to reach us. They're trying to spread a message to us. Yes, they're trying to unify the party and gather people together and get everyone all riled up and supportive of what's going to happen, and that's vitally important. But a big part of these conventions is offering a message to the nation. We are the nation, and we get to decide what that message ultimately has been and what we think about it. So don't just look at these conventions as display or as empty ritual. Really think about the fact that they are deliberately staged statements to the American public. What what are we seeing? What statement have they decided to send? And how do we feel about that statement? That's important. And I think that's important now regarding anything having to do with this presidential campaign. There's a lot of effort being put into telling us what we ought to be feeling and who we ought to be supporting and who we ought to be dumping along the wayside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What matters more than anything else is what we, the American people, think. And the effort being put into convincing us of one thing or another is worth noticing. But it's really important to remember that ultimately that's not what determines outcomes. We determine outcomes. And the convention, the display and hoo-ha of a convention, that's a reminder that we matter. That's a small d democratic message at a moment when we really need to be thinking about and defending democracy. That's an important part of that process, that democratic small d process, is remembering that the conventions are about us. They're about communicating to us, and that in the end, we make the choices. So regardless of who's yelling what at whatever level at conventions or outside of conventions, we make the decisions. So I will repeat, I don't remember if I said this last week. I know I've been howling it on social media. Despite what we see at conventions, despite what everyone is yelling, at this particular moment, nothing is inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, truly. Uh, I always talk about contingency. Those of you who are regulars here, we sometimes in the past played bingo, and contingency was always on our bingo cards because I said it almost every week. Because if you're studying history, you have to remember that everything is contingent. People are looking forward in time and they don't know what's coming next. They're not looking backward in time and fully understanding what's to come. We are looking forward in time and not knowing what's coming next, like any of the historical characters that I study. This is a moment of extreme, extreme contingency when we truly don't know what's going to happen. And the conventions are going to sell you the idea that, well, we know what's going to happen. This is going to happen. And here are all the reasons why it's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of what we're being sold, no one truly at this moment knows what's going to happen. We are at a moment of being tested as a nation. We are at a moment when democracy is in danger. And for that reason, we need to be smart consumers of the products being pitched to us, supposedly in the name of democracy. We have to watch, we have to think, we have to evaluate, and we have to really think for ourselves, not just about what we're seeing, but about what we conclude about it, what we think about it, think, not just feel, and how that might affect what we're going to be doing in months to come. Okay, I'm 1 minute over. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to move my notes. So for those of you who are new, I'm wiping my lipstick. For those of you who are new, every week for 225, thank you. Five. I honestly, I don't know what the mental block is that I can never remember, but I can never remember. 225 weeks, I have a mug that represents is tied into the theme of what we're talking about. And sometimes I'm closer than others. Sometimes I have to really you have to travel with me. This might be a little bit of a trip, but you got to come with me that this is actually related to what we're talking about. And I think this is a Carolee mug. Carolee will tell us if it is a Carolee mug. Oops, a little bit more lipstick. And I'm not saying this to promote myself. The mug is Making the World a Better Place since 1962. That is when I was born, but what I was focused on was the year, right? That years matter and that we're at an election year. And that is why I chose this mug. That's, as I said, not the absolutely most on target, but when I was scrounging in my cupboard, that's what I thought.
Mhm. I see that, Joanne. And so then I'm going to ask you to come along with me as you look at the one that I chose for today,
Yeah.
because I'm exhausted by all of this.
Yes.
So I chose, I really need a day between Saturday and Sunday.
I think I support that mug choice. Yes. I do.
It is a lot.
It is a
So
lot.
we have so many questions in the chat, Joanne. So I'm
I can
gonna
imagine.
right into it. So a question from Ben that you already addressed a little bit about examples of the past where a political party has faced a similar level of uncertainty and internal strife. Um, would history suggest that it's possible to leverage the convention to unify and demonstrate a clear path forward, or is it more likely to highlight the discord?
It could. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the convention, in some way or another, if the people organizing that convention thought of that idea let me change my screen here so that I can see the questions and you at the same time.
Right.
La la la. Wouldn't it be nice if that were the case, that the people organizing that convention said, you know what, I know we look as though we're in disarray. What if we come together and come forward with a united message? I suppose they could do that and still not be absolutely sure about a candidate. I have no idea. I mean, I honestly, all this past week, I've been speaking in one press outlet or another, because whenever something bad politically happens that involves violence, suddenly people need to talk to me. And what I've been saying over and over again is truly, we don't know. We just don't know. In a way, you could kind of predict what was going to happen at the Republican convention, and we don't know what's going to happen at the Democratic convention. It would be nice if the Democrats, knowing where we're standing, seeing where we are, could actually rise above what they have been doing and show a display of unity for a candidate and a ticket and show people that sense of purpose. I have no idea if we will see that. We can hope.
Mhm.
So yeah, it could. It could happen. I honestly don't know. I don't know if we're going to see, a contested or what they might call a brokered convention when people who are pledged to candidates are no longer pledged because they can't pick a candidate. Is it going to be the kind of convention that goes on for a long time? Is it going to be the kind of convention where there's argument? I mean, so there have been so many moments politically that speaking as a see now I am starting to sweat. Speaking as a as a political historian, the political historian part of my brain says, oh, this is interesting. Who knows what's going to happen? And the larger Joanne Freeman citizen part of my brain is just in a state of exhaustion and I don't want to say panic, but high intensity. Let's call it that.
Mhm.
Um, I'll be watching. We
Yep.
should all be watching because what will be interesting will be what the Democrats decide they need to say, what they actually say, and what we see and decipher. And those will not necessarily all be the same things.
And it's all live on TV
Mhm.
and it's very curated and it just, yeah, there's a lot goes into it.
It's yeah.
So here's a logistical question from Linda. Can the Democrats add a new candidate during the convention and then successfully get that person on the ballot? According to Ballotpedia, the deadlines have already passed for a number of states. Do you think that folks like Obama, Pelosi, Schumer, et cetera, would encourage Biden to step down if we can't get anyone else on the ballot?
Well, now I last week I talked about this a little bit, and I actually looked up dates when you could or couldn't get people on the ballots, and it's true. I think in some places perhaps the date has passed. I think in other places, um, there's still the ability until part of August to get people on a ballot. So I actually don't know how entirely impossible it is to put someone on the ballot. And even, well, I was going to say, even if it were impossible, who the heck knows? I honestly, really, folks, I'm not. I'm past trying to predict. And I think being in this moment is about realizing that we can't predict and that we need to be, as I suggested at the end of my comments, watching and thinking and really evaluating what we're seeing because even the experts, they don't know what's happening either, right? They think they do. They think they're controlling it. And I mean, the Democrats particularly appear to be running in circles and smacking each other around. That does not suggest people who are unified and organized at this current moment. The convention supposedly is aimed at showing unity of some kind and a decision. Hard to know how that's going to happen or if it will happen, but I'll be watching to see what they're showing versus what they think they're showing. And I
So
say that as someone who vote's Democratic. So, you know,
So a question from Deb and Paul. Um, do political parties in countries with a parliamentary system hold any sort of meeting that is similar to US political party conventions?
sometimes in some countries they do. I mean, I think I was, and I'm going to get this wrong. I think I was reading this morning about Thailand, about conventions in Thailand. Because why not? Because, when I prepare for these sessions, I'm all over Google, like saying, I wonder what, oh, Thailand. So I don't really know the answer to that question. But what's particular about conventions is the way that they reflect the culture and the politics of whatever nation they're coming from, right? So depending on how small d democratic, how much a choice is really up to the people, how the electoral system works, all of that is going to shape if there are conventions and what those conventions really represent, whether they represent just a display or whether there's actually a decision being made. And as much as they look ritualistic, conventions are where a decision is being made. Thus, all of the dark horse candidates in the 19th century. Something actually does happen at these conventions, and that is part of the democratic process, right? That's should be reassuring that a process has to happen. We witness the process. Um, so that does reflect us. That does reflect our system of government. Um, I
And it's
see I see people in chat talking about Trump's Trump's speech. Well, let me say something. So Susan is talking about polling numbers, and there are many things I thought about talking about today, and several people said, "Well, what about this thing about polls on the one hand and the press on the other hand, and party operatives privately on the other hand?" And I guess I would encourage people um, to take everything with a grain of salt, right? Um, Polling does that. Some polling numbers
Mhm.
look bad for Biden. Some polling numbers do not. Um, and we have seen a lot of elections in which polls have dramatically predicted one thing, and that's really, really, really not what happened. So I'm not saying disregard all polls, but I am saying don't see them as the gospel truth. They are suggestive. They are evidence. We evaluate the evidence. We compare evidence. We decide what we think is likely and logical. We are good historians who look at evidence as evidence. So polls are kind of evidence, and we can do some of the interpretation of that evidence. So yeah, when people say, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, if someone says, well, the polls look horrible, and so we need to change a candidate, that is not enough
Mhm.
for me to think that. It's indicative, it's suggestive, it says we better think. But right now there are so many mixed messages and so much, and for so long, an attempt for some to decide, announce, eliminate President Biden as a candidate, in a really strong, loud way that's been very persistent. Maybe that's for good reason, maybe it isn't, but it's been so loud and so overbearing and so consistent. It's hard not to push back against it because it feels so weirdly deliberate in a way. So I'm not going to tell anybody what they should think or shouldn't think, and I'm also not going to tell anyone or make any pronouncement about whether I think Biden should or shouldn't be on the ticket. But I will say there's a great example pre-convention of people sending out messages with great certainty, sometimes really saying that it's inevitable. It's
Mhm.
inevitable, right? If President Biden runs, we will inevitably lose. And I swear to you, nothing is inevitable at this point. And if I said this to CNN, and whether it's going to be in a documentary on Sunday, you will know and I know. On camera to a documentary, if someone tells you that they know with certainty that something is inevitable, they are lying. I kind of hope that doesn't end up in the final version of this documentary, but at any rate, I I believe that to the bottom of my soul. No one knows. Really, no one knows. They want it. We all want some degree of inevitability. Um, and for that reason, the Democratic Convention this year is going to be a thing to watch. Because unlike most years, when it becomes kind of a coronation, Um, we don't know. We don't know what it will be.
I feel like that needs to be a mug or a t-shirt is nothing is inevitable.
I know. Nothing is inevitable. And what do I want to say? Like June 2024 to November 2020 on the bottom. Nothing is inevitable.
So we've got a question from Sydney. And Sydney asks, how do contemporary presidential conventions differ from presidential conventions in the past? And what does it say about the political climate surrounding the presidency?
Repeat the question for me.
So how do contemporary presidential conventions differ from those in the past? And what does it say about the political climate surrounding the presidency?
Well, one big way, this is obvious, but I'll say it anyway, that they differ is because they can be televised and, instantly we all get some kind of a image. And the further we go along in the modern era, the more tricky and high tech they can be. We all witnessed a virtual convention, right? I was thinking about that today too. Like, how weird was that? Um, there's so many weird things happening in our current moment. But the fact that they are televised, high tech, ever more high tech. And as I've said before, I always love talking about technology and democracy, because technology really fundamentally can shape democracy. And so anything that shapes the communication between people with political power and people who give that power to people, that it's a conversation. Democracy is an ongoing conversation between the people and the people they give power to, and any form of technology that shapes that conversation shapes democracy. And so, in the current moment, again, it's obvious, but I'll say with social media shaping everything, and um every other weird way in which, no matter how much you look online, sometimes you really, if you want to, can't even tell what's real or what isn't. That's going to shape, in ways mostly bad, probably not good, how we are experiencing these current conventions. It's not the first time technology has sort of shaped, conventions and how people accept them or don't accept them. I mean, I was thinking, because of course I was this morning, about 1844. I think 1844 was the first election, or it was in the late 1840s. That was the first convention in which the telegraph existed and was in use. And good old Benjamin Brown French, because Benjamin Brown French is like the Zelig of American history. And if something important happened in national politics somehow or other, he was there. So he was the guy working for the telegraph company when there was an election, a convention, and they were deciding candidates, and then the election itself. And he was frantically communicating with people saying, don't tell people the results wherever you are. Don't telegraph the results. Just like now, people say, like, don't call the results where you are because it'll shape the rest of the election. They were doing that with the telegraph in the 1840s, right? Just don't tell people how it's going. It'll shape the election. It'll warp the election. So part of the answer is technology and what it does or doesn't do. I mean, yesterday, interestingly, not the first time, but I'm watching part of former President Trump's speech, and I have social media open, and I can see, and there are news commentators afterwards, but in real time as he's speaking, people are saying, "What? Hannibal Lecter? Really?" Really? Like we went back to, so it's not only that something happens and the entire world sees it in a nanosecond. We see the whole conversation about it happening right in front of us because of social media. Again, that means we have to be savvy consumers, and we can see what people are saying and what people are doing, and then we have to decide for ourselves what we're seeing. But yeah, actually, I love the fact that Emma is now Emma the tour guide, because Emma is a tour guide. You're right. They weren't saying what they were saying. WTAF. That yes. It was loud. There was a lot of commentary. I forgot initially to tune in, and then when I opened social media, and I was like, "Oh, holy moly, something's happening at that convention! I better tune in." Yeah, as I said before, if conventions are trying to or are aimed at showing the public the goods for sale, that's what that speech was supposed to be doing. And I suppose it did. I think that speech should have been an indication that nothing is inevitable. Truly, nothing is inevitable. Okay, I'll stop. More
Oh,
questions.
more questions. We got a lot of them. So Becky wants to know how the delegates are chosen and for the convention. How many are associated with each state? And is there any equivalency in the federal delegate assignments for the final election?
Oh boy, I don't actually have a specific answer for that. I mean, it is true, and some delegates arrive at the convention and they're pledged. So it's partly a result of primaries and caucuses that you end up with delegates. And some delegates go to the convention and they're pledged, meaning they have to vote for the candidate that they're pledged to support. That said, if it appears that there is a tie of some sort or an inability to make a decision, then even candidates who are or delegates who are pledged can be break the pledge, again, depending on circumstances. So, as with so much else, and it's one of the fascinating things about studying American politics, and then one of the challenging things is that our federal system of government allows for so much diversity on a state level about how things work and when they work and the details of it. There is some uniformity, and then there's a lot that isn't uniform, which is sometimes why it's hard to answer these kinds of questions, because it varies state by state. And again, that tells you a lot about us as a nation, right? I mean, federalism, the idea that people are sovereign, that there are two forms of government that are sovereign. We are following. We are sovereign too, right? The national government and our state government, and that both of those. That was a huge issue at the Constitutional Convention. How can people follow two levels of government? How can two levels of government have that kind of sovereignty? Really? Like, we don't know how that works. They're coming for me now that I'm talking about federalism. I don't know if you can hear the siren, but there's sirens outside. At any rate, that's that's the only way that the Constitution really was accepted and ratified, was the idea that there wasn't just going to be some big, powerful national level of government, but that local government, state government still was going to be really, really powerful. There's a reason why, federal is in the Constitution, but not national. National is scary.
Mm.
And because of that, that's, elections are prime moments when the federal, not national component of our electoral system are really on display.
So a question from Francesca. She wants to know, when did the primaries start?
When did primaries start?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a specific answer to that. That's a really good question. I don't know. And is Tim here? Tim is always the guy who I turn to instantly, and I don't know if he's here or not because I haven't been watching.
He is here.
Okay, Tim, give us a date. I don't know formally. For those of you who are new here, Tim is the master of information like that. He's already progressive era. Tim is the Lynx king, says Ellen. Indeed, early 20th century. Okay, that makes sense. Progressive era, early 20th century. Yeah. You guys are zipping along here.
Oh,
And
it's going crazy, the chat.
it is, which I love. I have to say that what I love to see, and I don't even know what it's related to, but someone said to someone, I disagree. And that's good, because we can do that here.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that here. We do that here,
Mm-hmm.
like every week. That's precisely what everyone should be doing, right? Oh, you think that, huh? I don't think that. I think this. We disagree. What does that mean? Seems pretty simple, and apparently for some people, pretty impossible.
So we've got a couple more questions that I want to try to get in, and Daniel's got a couple comments in here that I'm going to try to condense into one. So it's essentially, why are Democrats going after Joe Biden? The
Right.
history of replacement candidates isn't good.
Right.
So why is this happening?
I mean, speaking as a political historian, the history of replacement candidates isn't good. Indeed. The fact that a party is publicly attacking itself from within not good. The fact that there isn't seemingly any kind of unified message, and from one day to another, we hear that, this person wants him out. No, this person doesn't want him out, but this person said they want him out. Actually, these three other people want him out. It's so hard to get reliable evidence right now. And what seems reliable one day then is not reliable the next. Um, I can't vouch for or speak for everyone's reason for deciding that President Biden shouldn't be the candidate. And some people are going to say it's about his health, and some people are going to say they don't think he can win, and some people are going to say they think Kamala Harris is a stronger candidate, and some people are going to say they don't want either of them. They want an entirely new ticket. I will say, as a political historian, there are a lot of stuff floating around out there that is nonsensical fantasy football. It just is. I mean, blitz primary, I'm sorry. But there are right. Thank you, Jessica. There are some ideas floating around out there that suggest to me that the people have no absolute sense of how things actually work on the ground. And they're out sort of, tossing off ideas that honestly, and I'm not saying this because I agree or disagree with what they want, but the process, yeah, like speed dating, says Kathy, the process, I can't even see how that could possibly work. And people not only are suggesting these ideas, but they're like fervently angry about the fact that they're going to work. If you're studying political history, part of that is studying what's possible at a given moment, right? What's actually possible on the ground, in the system, among people. You are interested in what might happen, what could happen, what people want to happen. All of those things are important, the culture of the moment, everything else. But in the end, what actually can happen on the ground is pretty vitally important. I remember once being at a symposium, and it was a mix of and I mean to say nothing bad about political scientists. It was a mix. I think it was all political scientists, and I think I was the only historian there. And they were talking about something having to do with pamphlets in like the late 18th century. I don't even remember, but there was a very lively discussion going on about pamphlets and how they would be distributed and et cetera, et cetera. And I remember I felt like, the history weenie. I said at one point, yeah, technologically that wasn't possible then. It's like, whoa. Right. I was like,
Bring in the receipts, Joanne.
history weenies for the win. Yeah. I mean, so that's all I have to say to a lot of the stuff floating around right now as possibilities. Some of them to me do not seem like serious possibilities. This is, I mean, historically speaking, the Democrats, because they are the party of inclusiveness and of big tent and of lots of possibilities and ideas, and of tolerance, it means you get people banging up against each other. They do not walk ever in lockstep, right?
Yeah.
Lockstep and the Democratic Party don't go very well together. Lockstep is a more falling in line kind of Republican Party thing to do. They're organized in a different kind of a way. And we're just seeing that play out in real time in the messiest way possible right now. Katja says, once again, the Republicans have been given carte blanche to control the dialogue. Well, yes and no. So here's what I would say. People watched Trump yesterday and came out with some strong feelings about it, not following along with their dialogue. And actually almost to the point of it being frustrating, saying, wow, like he's not a strong candidate. It's like, I'm sorry. But still, they aren't necessarily controlling the dialogue. It is a really good point that there's a lot of assumption about people saying things. Well, again, gets us back to inevitability. People controlling the dialogue in a sense and wanting us to believe one thing. And that's why, again, I would like that extra day, Jessica, because that would be a day when we could like breathe and maybe not have to consider possibilities and contingencies and outcomes. But we have to wrestle with them, and we will be. So, pace yourselves, people. And we are going to be here as a group, sort of going through the marathon together and figuring this out as a group, because I kind of think that's the best way to do it. Otherwise, you sit and or at least I do, I sit and like circle in my own little angst space about what might happen and seeing what other people have to say. Pace yourselves, people. That's a good mug.
Yes.
Pace yourselves, people. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Yeah, no, for sure.
Well, and we're on a timeline now. And that makes me think of always go back to 1968, where Minnesotan Hubert Humphrey, if he had had a few more months.
Right, right. Well, that's true. That's another logistical ground level thing, right?
Yeah,
Timelines.
that's a process thing. Again,
It's a
like
process thing. That totally is a process thing. And yes, Clinton says there are a lot of ways to misuse and distort polling, which is why just take all polling with a grain of salt. I'm not saying discard it, but I'm also definitely saying don't just buy it. Think about it. I have to ask, who a chunk of salt says that? Yes, indeed. Kay, did you get when in trouble, when in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout from me and my father? Because that's my father's thing. When in trouble, when in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout. I don't know if that's out there in the world or if I can attribute that to my father, but yeah, that's my father. Anyway, okay.
So we have 1 minute left, Joanne, and I want to address something that's going to be recorded for posterity before we jump into some of these other questions in the after party. There's a couple of questions about how do we get younger people to vote? So Kathleen says, I'm hearing many younger folks saying they will vote third party because they don't believe their vote matters. What can we say to them?
That's a really good question. And actually, maybe we'll go 1 or 2 minutes over because I want to hear what other people have to say. It's an important question, and that's what I'm hearing too. Yes, it's and some people it's all about Gaza. And it doesn't, no matter how many times, I say I understand that, but if Biden is not president, it's entirely possible you're not going to be able to do very much to even protest about it, never mind have an impact on it. Um, Purity voting is understandable, but at a moment when there's real danger at hand, it can do more damage than good. And I suppose, part of the answer to the question is, and for young people, they might not necessarily really fundamentally understand the danger of this moment because they haven't seen that many electoral moments and they're used to lots of extreme language and people getting upset about politics, possibly for their entire, young adult lives. And so part of the answer is really making people understand, young people understand the threat of this moment without making it sound like hyperbole, but really in a calm, rational way, explaining how what we're seeing is different from what typically happens, how what we're seeing in some ways is really abnormal. And again, historians and history teachers here, you can do that with evidence. I don't know how persuasive that's going to be, but I think that question about getting young people to really understand the stakes of this moment and the fact that what happens in this moment is going to dramatically shape their future in ways they can't even imagine. Um, Somehow or other, we do have to communicate that. I just don't know the absolute best answer. I'm looking, focus on abortion. That's one way for sure. Um, oh, Jen, it's not a marriage, it's a bus. Pick the one that gets closest to your destination. I like that idea. Um, Yeah, no, a lot of people, I'm hearing from a lot of people. My brother tells me about my niece is in college, and supposedly a lot of her friends are saying they're not going to vote, or they're going to vote for third party because they feel so, unhappy. Oh, and he's beaming in here. So yeah, but you're right. Abortion, the environment, the fact that their votes actually do matter. But again, the hard part about this is they've always heard this kind of tenor as young people, and somehow we have to get past that to communicate that this moment has its own particular things that are pretty darn high stakes. Um, that's not the answer to the question, but it's really, really, really important for us to think about it. It might even be worth, a session of History Matters about young people and politics, because young people in the past have had an amazing impact on politics. And maybe we can have that discussion, and then part of the discussion afterwards can be ideas that people have about how to reach young people because they could hold this election. They could.
We can enlist Claire and Sydney and all of our young friends
Yes.
here to talk to everybody that they know. about why they need to vote.
Yes. Maybe next week. Linda's like, yes, could be
Yes.
next week. Yeah. I actually that very well might make the most sense. I might, it's only one other time I think, has it happened that during an episode of History Matters that I was like, that's what we'll talk about for next week. But that makes a lot of sense actually for next week.
All right. So should we
Oh, we're a couple
explain?
minutes over.
Yeah, should we explain what happens next, Joanne?
Let us explain what happens next. Okay, folks. So what we are now going to do is segue into the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what happens so that we can be even freer and easier with our discussion than we have been, which it's not as though we're ever really formal, but we could talk about whatever the heck we want when we go to the after party. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. I want to say before we beam out of here, and someone just asked where Annie is. She's at a convention. She's at the SHEAR, Society of Historians of the Early American Republic convention. There she is. And she said she was going to beam in for the after party. I do want to say something that I said yesterday twice on a podcast and on a radio show about you guys, right? I was talking about how there's, what should be happening all over the place is what we do here every week. And that is that people should be coming together and talking about things and hashing things out and agreeing and disagreeing and trying to figure out what the heck is happening and trying to decide what you think about it. And I was saying again twice, so some people somewhere in America are going to be hearing this. I was saying all over the place yesterday, we do this every week. It could happen all over the place. It should happen all over the place. We don't all agree, right? We don't. So, at any rate, what we do here is important for us, for the people we come in contact with. It's important as a demonstration of what a healthy democracy can contain, right? People coming together and questioning things and working things out for each other. Every week, we demonstrate the working of democracy. Every week we do for 225 weeks. Yeah, remember the number. And it matters. It really, it really matters, folks. I say it every week. I think about it nowadays even more than I normally think about it, because where who the heck knows what's happening. But democracy should be front and center all the time in our political thoughts at the moment. So thank you guys as ever for being here and proving that we can do this and proving the good that it can do and being a community and showing communities can come together and help each other and work things out. And thank you to Jessica for being the everything person today. Much appreciated. And thank you to NCHE. And thank you to Claire for sending us the links to get us in. Thank you to Annie for beaming in from Philadelphia. Is that where you are? Philadelphia? Okay. And thanks to all of you guys. I hope you all have a wonderful week. And we will be here as ever on Friday, talking maybe about young people in the vote. And if we do, I encourage you to think about that and what you might say are useful ways, given that a lot of people here are teachers who deal with young people all the time. Think about how you might answer that question. Okay. And we're